of course, one was subjected to the rigorous ideological straitjacket when it came to sociology, when it came to modern history, when it came to political science or international relations. But you could really do your classics, or not to mention natural sciences. You could do your history harking back to, say, pre-World War I period, or you could do your literary criticism, provided that, again, it deals with topics that predate the revolutionary period of 1917, pretty much as comprehensively and even less ideologically than would be the case in the West. However, what has happened over the past 20 years is that these notions of reforms in the direction of getting rid of the baggage of old patriarchal, hierarchical structure of education, which placed a premium on what one might call elitist or elite educational content, has gone very far towards, in fact, demolishing the quality education that had been inherited from previous generations, and that the dumbing down of Eastern Europe is actually in full swing, which is regrettable, because I know from the example of my youngest daughter, who is in high school, that compared to what she's doing today in the United States, my own third grade in high school back in Belgrade in 1972 was, in fact, much more comprehensive, much better quality, and equipped me far, far better for an academic curriculum later on in life, both in Serbia and in the United Kingdom. And when I look at other East Europeans around the world, whether it's the Russians in Israel or in New York, or Serbian doctors in Toronto, or architects and electronics engineers in California, or the Poles in Ireland or London, you will see that there is a surprising ability to get on in life, to advance both professionally and personally, and it was all due to the fact that classical education models were pretty well preserved under communism. The second area that is under serious assault is family. Over the past 20 years, these cultural Marxist experiments based on the mantra of race, gender, and ethnicity have been promoted all over Eastern Europe in terms of anti-racist campaigns. The designated victim group were the Gypsies or Roma. And because you need to have this mantra repeated ad nauseum in each and every society, the Gypsies became the designated blacks, the victims of centuries of discrimination and underprivilege. And the gender roles, of course, were explored extensively in the context of allegedly rigid patriarchal societies that were oppressing women. And as far as sexuality is concerned, well, the discovery of the gay oppression in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, most notably by the Open Society Institute of George Soros, has now resulted in idiosyncrasies such as the first gay pride parade in Belgrade in the second week of October of 2010, which, by the way, was attended by the U.S. Ambassador Mary Warlock, by her European Union equivalent, and praised 2 days later by Hillary Clinton on her arrival in Belgrade on a state visit. So, ridiculously enough, these cultural Marxist obsessions based on race, gender, and sexuality are in fact presented by the political class of the Western world as the way to go, as the ticket to modernity, the ticket to integration into the EU, into the Western postmodernia. And this is something that the elite classes of Eastern Europe are beginning to embrace. The people, by and large, are still resistant to it, but the elites are already bought.
Do you see a similarity between American current situation?
Well, the similarity is in that in both cases it is a process imposed from above. But in the United States, it has been going on for longer, and I'm afraid it has penetrated deeper. At the moment in Eastern Europe, it is still limited to a somewhat narrow circle of the decision-making elite in academia, in the media, and in government policy. In the United States, it has penetrated 1 or 2 notches below. And there is still, the pickup truck driving, hard-working nation out there, grumbling and grinning and bearing it. But the circle of people who have internalized these idiocies as a normal part of their world outlook is, I would say, much wider.
What would you say to someone that says all this fancy talk, all this science is really just a cover for a deep-seated racism?
Well, deep-seated racism is an ideological term devoid of any meaning. It is used whenever you want to blacken someone without entering into a serious dialogue. If you have, say, a Fox presenter who simply repeats a well-known fact that 70% of Americans don't want Ground Zero mosque, indignant women taking part in the same interview will walk away and accuse him of racism, as if stating something that is obvious but ideologically uncomfortable is in itself inherently racist. In other words, racism has become a term not only of abuse, but also a term of intellectually bankrupt abuse, because it is just like fascism, it's just like reductio ad Hitlerum, where you reduce everybody to the F word. Everyone who you disagree with becomes a fascist, just as you elevate your own politically correct views to the received wisdom that is turned into the only acceptable discourse. And that, indeed, is a totalitarian trait. It started back in the 18th century when Jean-Jacques Rousseau introduced the concept of general will, volonté générale, which simply means the will of the person speaking. And likewise, today we have the will of the international community, which means the will of the White House and the State Department. And likewise, the acceptable discourse in the United States is the discourse of the person conducting the discourse.
How has H.L. Mencken affected you?
By opening my eyes to the fact that many of the idiocies and many of the stupidities we see around us are not a recent phenomenon, that the potential for them had been there for a long time, and in particular back in the 1920s and 30s, that some of the already pretty mature forms of its then contemporary manifestations were in evidence, but I still think he would be horrified if he could see what they have morphed into half a century later. Back in the 1920s, for instance, or the 1930s, he wrote very disparagingly about the advocates of prohibition and the mindless arguments that were invoked in support of it. He also mentioned the single-mindedness with which the supporters of America's intervention in World War I were prepared to go beyond the logic and empirical evidence in pursuit of their ideological objectives. And we see something very similar today. People decide what is the desirable outcome of whatever project they're pursuing, and then they will make sure that it is reached by whatever means necessary. Whether they're illegal or unconstitutional doesn't matter.